Thanks very much. This was a fascinating panel of how this looks in practice. So we've done the academic world, we've done the practical world, and now the questions being asked, why sustainable disclosure ignites policymakers' agendas. And to help us set this question on fire, we have Professor Weber. No? Okay.
So, I'm going to change a little bit the organization here. Because this is the final topic of the day, before the dinner. And it is called, for some reasons, Firesite Chat. And there is no fire here, but I think the topic is highly flammable. So we have a good chance, actually. And I'm going to first introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to invite the iconic personality, which you mentioned before. So let me invite to the stage Irene Heemskerk first, Head of Climate Change Center, European Central Bank since 2021. Very, very special to the ISSB. Please take a seat. In her role, she is responsible for shaping and steering the ECB climate agenda internally and externally. She represents also the ECB in the Central Bank and Supervisory Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS, is an observer to the EFRAG Sustainability Board, member of the Time Magazine 2030 Committee advising on solutions for the future. And prior to joining the ECB, Irene was involved as a sustainability fellow in the work of the IFRS Foundation on setting up the Sustainability Standards Board. So from 2005 till 2020, she has been in different positions at the Netherlands Bank. And as advisor to the chair, she was involved in the work of the NGFS from its launch in 2017 and led the work of the first publication of the NGFS on supervisory practices addressing climate-related and environmental risks. So very instrumental to ISSB, very instrumental to NGFS. Thanks for joining us. Our next panelist, or fireside chatter, is Patrick Hoedjes. I'm right with the name pronunciation? Kind of, sort of Patrick, I'm saying with Patrick. Head of the Supervisory Process Department at EIOPA since 2024. Has worked in different capacities at EIOPA since its inception, holding responsibility for various areas of work within the organization, such as operations and oversight, and has been also vice chair of the FSB Working Group on Private Pension Scheme Resilience, chair of the Long-Term Investment Task Force, chair of the IT and Data Committee, and EIOPA Ethics Officer. Prior to joining EIOPA, Patrick worked at the Dutch National Central Bank, spending more than 10 years in various positions in pension supervision, cash operations, and statistics as head of the unit for supervision statistics for financial institutions. Thanks for joining us today. And now, to ease us into this fireside thing, we have a really iconic personality, I dare to say. Iconic because Axel Weber is a German economist, professor, European central banker, global bank manager, chairman of the Trilateral Commission Europe, member and trustee of the Group of 30, president of the Center for Financial Studies at Goethe University, Frankfurt. I think if I follow everything you have done and everything you're a member, we will be most probably over our time. So I just invite you to start with your impulse. Thank you, Axel, for joining.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here for this ISSB conference. Let me start by saying the last time I was in this room teaching was 25 years ago when I was a professor at Goethe. And I'm very glad to be back as the chairman of the institute where I was once director, and the university and the House of Finance, which all have been generated over the last 25 years, and also the SAFE have been really major steps of this university moving forward and becoming very international and very visible. So very glad to be here. I have been chairman of the IIF, which is the Global Banking Institute, for the last 6-8 years, in addition to leading UBS. And my passion for environmental issues comes from the fact that it's become as was said this morning by Emmanuel, it's become a business factor. And for businesses, this is a very important area. So let me start because I interpret the title somewhat more loosely than it is here. Not why sustainability disclosures will ignite policymakers' action, but what policy action will be kicked off and ignited by the sustainability disclosures. And, maybe because we talked about sustainability and disclosure, and it sounded like an accountant exercise for most of the day. But let me just completely step back and give you sort of a 35,000 feet view very quickly, and then try and move into the standards fast. So the world economy, and I think the global economies, I always characterize when I give a 30,000 feet talk by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What are these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? They're the growth rates of the mature world. Europe and Japan roughly grow 1% on average trend. The US is 2, but if you look at per capita growth, US and Europe are 1% per capita. The major difference between the US and Europe and Japan is a different demographic and a different policy towards immigration. But just to explain that, 3 is the world average growth. 4 is where you have emerging markets. 5 is where China is now, and 6 to 7 is where India is. And most of this growth, in particular the one that is above the average global of 3, is the one that matters for this topic. Because when we talk about sustainability, unlike it sounds here, it's much less about changing corporate behavior in the mature world, in the industrial countries. It's more about helping Asia and Africa and emerging markets to make a transition from coal into more sustainable energy resources. Now, that means you need to go back and bring other people into the game, but it doesn't mean you don't need to change corporates in the mature world. You need to do that as well. And so you get very quickly to a very diverse agenda when you talk about global sustainability, where you need action on multiple fronts by multiple actors, fast, with a lot of money. And that's just the opposite of what we've seen over the last 25 years. We've seen very few actions, very few players, no money in the game, and we're late. So how can you change that? I'm going to report some paragraphs from a paper which is written from the Bretton Woods Committee, which is another committee I help occasionally at the IMF meetings to advise the IMF. And it's all about creating a greener IMF and a greener World Bank. And you will have seen that that's on top of these agencies. And I think we do need them. The biggest question when it comes to the international arena is who is in charge of global climate? You have the UN in parts of this, you have the Conference of the People, you have very many players, but nobody is really in charge. And the best thing we could do is create a new sustainability authority like the IMF globally, but it'll take way too long. So we need to work with what we got. And this is why the committee has suggested that the IMF and the World Bank need to step up, become greener, and play a much more of a coordinating role, because we don't have the time to invent that. And that involves a lot of things that I'll briefly talk about. Second, I think when you look at where we are now, you have to really be clear about what the problem is. The problem is no longer that we can find excuses that technology stands in the way of making that transition. Technology and technology advances are happening, and they can be used, but it involves a major financing scheme. Because if you look at where carbon reductions come from over the last couple of years, most of the carbon reduction comes from the US reducing their carbon footprint by moving away from fossil fuel and moving into other forms of energy. And if you look at what's the next stop, well, the next stop is Europe moving back from a cyclical response back into more carbon after the Ukraine war, and then going back onto the trajectory to decarbonize the European economy. And the big elephants in the room are Southeast Asia, are China, and are all of the emerging markets, where basically fossil fuel is happening. Now, of course, these energy transitions require technology. And the new technologies on energy are not invented in the emerging markets. They're invented in the mature world. So it requires technology transfer from the mature countries into the emerging markets, but it needs to come with a lot of financing because the emerging markets are that part of the world that has historically had the lower development in terms of levels, not in terms of growth rates, but their growth rates simply reflect that they're very far behind in terms of levels. They're the ones that are plagued by debt problems. They are the ones that are most affected by the current cyclical problems. They have the lower part of the global wealth pyramid. Most of the markets we're talking about, people live at the lower end of incomes, and these markets in general have been challenged for many, many years. And so when you look at what needs to happen, you need a transition in the supply of clean energy to happen in mature countries, including China, which has by now emerged a lot, but still has an emerging market energy backbone. Most of the industrial countries are much further. So clean energy transition and greening the economy is part of what the mature countries need to do. And that's where the work of the ISSB and everyone comes in, because that needs to be a transition of the real economy. There was an initial attempt by Mark Carney and others on the financial task force to really make the financial industry, and this was most of my interaction with them when I was still in my financial jobs, make the financial industry the stakeholder and the transmitter of here's where we need to go, your financing should be directed that way, and the corporate world will follow. There was initially euphoria around that because it was a big business opportunity for the banks, but it didn't happen. The banks are actually scaling back. Financial institutions are scaling back their commitments because, like everything you start, at some point there's some headwinds. And so what's become very clear with disclosure standards, this is a transition of the real economy. It needs to happen in the corporates, and of course only if the corporates have readable, digestible, and clear and comparable disclosures around their carbon footprint, their carbon requirements, and their plans, the financial sector can find better investment decisions and lead the money to where it's needed and invest in those that have a future and divest from those that have challenges to their future, basically in the one dimension of carbon. But that's not all we need to do. We need to also find the money to help the emerging markets to make that transition. And this is why for us in the group, it's very, very important that World Bank and IMF and the institutions we usually use when it comes to poverty reduction, to development, or to fighting financial crises, they need to play a key role. But if you simply add greening the globe to their mandate, you very easily create trade-offs. Somehow you want to take money away from some of their traditional tasks to this new task. Well, if we have a financial crisis, the money will be missing for that. So it requires additional money. And that's where our role as experts who have been in this game for most of their life is to tell governments who basically are coming in every 4 years, it needs to be your priority to put new money on the table to finance this. It's important. Doesn't mean that the other stuff is no longer important. So it's a lot of new commitments in a very, very small timescale. Adaptation action is going to be very, very important because preventing further mistakes. We talked about the global commons, we talked about forests, we talked about deforestation and reforestation, we talked about all of these issues. That's very, very important because we made a lot of mistakes, and avoiding further mistakes that are detrimental to climate is part of the solution as it is to turn around some of these trends around energy backbones. But there's where you come into some problems when you talk about the disclosure. In the report, we touch the ISSB task twice. The first thing that we touch is we feel it's really good to have a single standard, and the ISSB is a major innovation since COP26 that we all, in a very short period of time, have seen massive moves on basically providing a basic disclosure that even the SEC has largely sort of adapted in substance. The only thing where Europe and the US have a major disagreement is on Scope 3. Now, at some point, that will come, but don't hold your breath. The risk is that, like on financial accounting standards, we will see a difference in disclosures and in standards between IFRS and US GAAP on the financial side, penetrate disclosures around sustainability. Now, that will be very, very bad because global climate is a single issue for the single planet, and we need and should have a single standard when it comes to that. So we need to really work hard at that. I think that will bring us a long way, but I'm also paid for being controversial, so I'll be a bit controversial about this. I think, and I heard that on the last panel, well, voluntary and mandatory disclosures is fine. And I think it's all the right thing. Both mandatory and voluntary. But voluntary implementation through shareholders and boards will not deliver, in my view, what is needed. I think you also need mandatory enforcement. And that's where we probably start disappearing and departing from some of the views that so far this has been seen as something, empower the shareholders, empower the boards, they will do it. I led a board for 10 years. You can go so far with a board, but there are very different interests occasionally between boards wanting to go in that direction and their shareholders who may have much more shorter-term motives. So at some point, we need to move to more mandatory enforcement. And I think we also, if you move to mandatory enforcement, you will get much more headway in the direction of requirements across jurisdiction, because if it's mandatorily enforced in one jurisdiction and there's a lower standard in another jurisdiction, I can tell you there will be a lot of pressure in the lower jurisdictional standard to basically converge to a global standard that is then enforced globally. And some institutions like the IMF and the World Bank can play a role in that. Second, who should enforce that? Well, market regulators need to play a key role in that. The consistency of sustainable disclosures, even if mandatory, does not secure that they're necessarily in line with corporate financial statements, and therefore you need somebody that maps these two into one another, and that can only be market supervisors. So you need a system where the regulatory world takes on both of these standards and looks at consistency and looks at enforcement. And greenwashing is just one such example where you can say what you want, but actually this is actually misleading investors if you make the wrong disclosures, and therefore there should be an enforcement mechanism behind that that brings you back. So regulators, market regulators, need to play a key role. They've been pretty reluctant in doing that so far. They first want to see the system and then they want to talk about it, but I think it needs to be clear. Finally, what is missing? What is missing is a role for markets. I think with all of this mandatory disclosures, mandatory enforcement even, what we do need is a global market where we have proper price signals for the true cost of fossil fuels. Where we need to go is a public and private sector journey towards establishing a global high integrity market for carbon emissions and carbon trading. And once you move to such a market, which at the moment is not really at the core of building a global infrastructure, it exists, it does take on, but I can tell you the real carbon price, even in the most expensive carbon markets, is roughly only at 10% of where the carbon price should be and needs to be if all of the external effects were endogenized through a single price. So there's a major impact that you will see on pricing if you move to a global carbon market and carbon pricing that really reflects the global cost of carbon. And of course, you need to enforce something else, and I'll close with that. You need a global carbon cross-border adjustment tax. You cannot have markets that price this in different constituency. You know, it's like having exchange markets without an exchange rate. Unless you actually have a cross-border carbon adjustment tax that will endogenize some of the jurisdictional differences between carbon pricing markets, you will not get to a single market. So the only way you can come to a global market that will converge is to actually have these cross-border adjustment tax. And then you need to use, and this is the disturbing part, you need to use these cross-border adjustment taxes not to work with the fiscal authorities in one jurisdiction or another. You need to transfer all of that money to emerging markets to help them in their transition, because they have no ability to raise that kind of money that is needed. So look at cross-border adjustment taxes and carbon taxes as a tax on the mature world on behalf of the energy transition of the developing and the least developed countries. Only if you do that, it all squares up. And we're a hell of a way from that. But it's very important that we're starting somewhere. And I think the ISSB work and the standards are a core development on how we will get there, but a lot more action is needed. Thank you for your attention.
Well, not less than I expected, not one impulse, but many impulses. So you mentioned a question, who is in charge? And who is in charge for climate? We're sitting here in the center of Europe. We're sitting here in Frankfurt, the head of the place where also ECB sits. So I cannot avoid asking you, Irene. The European Central Bank Climate and Nature Plan 2024-25 is a comprehensive strategy to address climate change and biodiversity loss, by the way. So you have three focus areas: implication on the green transition, physical impact of climate change, the risk that nature loss and degradation pose to the economy. So how does the ECB Climate and Nature Plan address the link to the importance of sustainability disclosure standards, and how do these standards support the ECB goals for navigating, in particular, the green transition?
I hope it works.
It does really.
Okay, that's great. Very happy to be here today at the ISSB. And I want to start with a meeting I had this morning, because I met the delegate of Samoa to the UNFCCC climate negotiations that are currently taking place in Bonn. He was telling me on how his family is currently seeking to which country they will be seeking asylum. Oh, right? Just to put that, like, this is happening in the planet at this stage. So if we're talking about mandatory and voluntary disclosures, I don't think we have the luxury of time to wait too long till we have a perfect voluntary system in place. But we need to move up and scale up our actions as soon as possible, because we're terribly, terribly late. If I look at the question also, like, what is Ignite's policymakers' agenda? Sometimes we get the question at the ECB, why climate? What makes climate change different than any other risks that are currently developing? Well, first of all, it's systemic, and it's very likely doomed to happen. So there are often, we don't know yet which war will start when, but for climate change, we know, and we have to get the policies in place to address it. If we don't get the policy in place, we'll face the physical risks. Secondly, it's the irreversibility. So climate change only increases. It's not that we're coming to a 3 degrees world and all of a sudden, oh, let's put more some policies in place, maybe we can reduce it. It's likely irreversible. So there's one trajectory. Lastly, it's really spread across the economy. So really through all transmission channels. A lower water level in the Panama Channel disrupts supply chain somewhere else in the world. So these three elements really make it unique and make it urgent for us to address it. And that's why we issued the Climate and Nature Plan. Indeed, last January, we identified 3 areas that we need to further focus on. It's on navigating to the transition. So how will this transition being financed? So I very much agree with Professor Weber that it will need a lot of money. What is the finance gap in Europe? Who's going to pay for it? What is the macroeconomic impacts on supply chains, on inflation that we're already seeing? So the droughts in 2020 already impacted the food price inflation in 23, 0.8%. So there is already the increase coming. We looked together with IOPA to the climate insurance protection gap. So there is an increase in physical risk, but only a quarter of all natural catastrophes in Europe are insured. That means that there will be a high pressure on the European economy, on the people in the first place, of course, but do they have the buffer from the insurance? And will there be reinsurance or will the government need to step in? So that will put pressure on the fiscal space. So that's what we're seeing already. And lastly, we're working really hard to have banks manage climate and environment related risks. So moving from 2019, when we checked with all banks, how do you see climate and nature impacting your bank as a risk? 2019, only 20% of the banks said it's likely material. We issued supervisory expectations in 2020, let banks do a self-assessment in 2021. We did a thematic review in 2020. Where do they stand vis-a-vis our supervisory expectations? We found that not enough yet. And in 2023, we looked again, what is the materiality of climate and environmental risk for banks? Now 90% of all the banks said yes, climate and environmental risk are material to us. And this brings me to your question on why are disclosures of the real economy so important? Because for banks to manage their risks, they need to know what's happening in the real economy. What are the companies doing? And we're really like, the financial sector can only be as green as the real economy because that's what they finance. But to know what they're financing in, where their physical risks sit, because I think this is really increasing, and also where the transition risks sit, because now there's really still a high dependency of banks' interest income on fossil industries. My last point I want to make is the tunnel vision we've been having on climate. It's so important to look broader to the environmental impact. We did a research last year on the dependency of 4.2 million companies in Europe on their dependency on ecosystem services. And we found that over 3 million are highly dependent on at least one ecosystem service. So that means fresh water, fresh air, fertile lands. And besides that, environmental risks are really highly connected with climate change. So to have this addressed in an integrated approach, look into climate, but also the impact of the environment, both are key. So pushing forward with the climate and environmental risk, having companies disclosing reliable, meaningful, and also comparable data. This is so key. And I heard the example on the car from the professor. It's the same as, for example, on energy labels for real estate, for your houses. It's not the same. C is not the same all across Europe. So this standardization needs to happen. So within Europe, but also on a global level. And I really want to applaud the ISSB and EFRAG for working together so hard on getting the interoperability guidance out last month, because that really helps us to move towards a more comparable, globally system of disclosures, and hopefully gives us insights in the risks, but also gives us insights on the opportunities and what you can finance.
Well, thank you for that. I think we feel encouraged to hear these words, and I think we will be very interested to look into some data from your research on biodiversity, ecosystem services, or the dependence of companies, because we'll base our future work on research on such kind of valuable inputs. And to your point, looking into companies disclosing meaningful, reliable, and comparable information, let me build a slightly different angle and ask Patrick about his view, because the European Insurance and Occupation Pension Authority, EIOPA, along with the other European supervisory authorities, has been actively working on sustainability disclosures. And few days ago, recently, the ESAs published their final report on greenwashing and are calling upon the financial market players to their responsibility to provide sustainable information that's fair, clear, and not misleading. So how does EIOPA plan to ensure that financial market players are effectively fulfilling this responsibility in terms of sustainability disclosures and ideally also adherence to the SSB standards?
Many thanks, and many thanks also for the kind invitation to be here and to talk a little bit about the work IOPA is doing in this area. Maybe to answer the last question first, yes, it is aligned. And I think it's very important work. Maybe to take it also first a step back and to say a little bit about the role of insurance. I think in a way, it has, of course, the two sides that are involved in the climate risks. On one side, like banks, they're investors, so they support, you could say, the real economy through investments, and in that sense can steer, of course, also the direction the economy is taking. So for that part, they also would need good information to see where their investments would make the most sense, but they're also exposed to the risk at the same time. They are the ones that insure the risks. Not all the risks, as Irene mentioned, and that is, I think, also has to be clarified. Those risks in the majority, a large majority, fall on the national states now. And the question is, of course, also how long will this system be affordable in the way it's set up currently? So I think there are many angles in which we can touch upon this particular question on why the sustainability disclosure matter, because they matter from all these different angles. And maybe on the first side, if we layer it in these three areas, the first one is indeed understanding the risk. For us, it's important, not only as investors, but also as underwriters, to make sure that we fully understand the risk. So standardization is, of course, key to have that comparability. It is also important for us as a second layer, and this is where your question comes from, how then, as supervisors, are we preparing ourselves? Because we are also, in the one hand, going a little bit in uncharted territory for ourselves as well. We are facing new risks for us as supervisors, and do we fully understand those risks? And the final part of the puzzle is, of course, the citizens. They are impacted as well. They're impacted through the ability or inability to have access to insurance, and also the ability to understand which risks they themselves are exposed to in terms of climate risk. So all these three angles we are working on through different methods. And maybe on the point of the supervisors, we had a discussion also. We had 2 weeks ago, we had our strategic discussion with our board of supervisors, and it was about indeed transition plans and what would be the role of the supervisor. Are we then the ones as financial supervisors that need to say whether or not a company is green or not green? I think that was the fear and the concern that the supervisors have. Where is our responsibility ending in this sense? And the answer is not fully clear, because in a way we can say, and this is what we try to do, it is a risk as other risks. So in a sense, we as supervisors are in the business of risk management. This is a new risk that is emerging. We need to understand it, but in a way, financially, we manage it just as other risks. But of course, that's not the full story, because in order then to understand the risk, you need to go that step further. You need to understand indeed whether or not the claims that are made are true or not, because if you're not able to do that, then you're not able to assess the risks that companies are running. So in a way, whether we like it or not as financial supervisors, we are in this business also, because it is indeed, as Irene mentioned, it's the big risk that is coming, and it's unavoidable. We can even argue if it's a risk that we are talking about, because risk tend to have a sort of a level of how much it can materialize. Here we know that some of the elements are going to materialize, and we need to make sure that we prepare for that. So I think on these three lines we're doing a lot of work, and disclosure, it starts with disclosure, because it starts with understanding and quantifying risk. And without that understanding, so without standards, you can't do anything.
Well, Patrick says we have to start with disclosure, and risk will materialize. We actually see a lot of this risk is actual, it's no longer a risk anymore. Irene says we don't have that much of time. And Axel, you said very clear recommendations in your impulse statement, and you shared with us ahead of that session this strengthening the Bretton Woods institutions to meet 21st century global challenges, so the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO of this world. What is needed, and how the ISSB can be instrumental? Maybe you take the microphone.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I do think that ultimately, like for financial crisis, we've all lived through several financial crises, and you need somebody in charge to manage a crisis. We have a global climate crisis, and we need somebody in charge to manage that at the global level. We do have, I think, a necessary network and web of local institutions, regional institutions like the ECB, IOPA, and others, but global coordination at the level of the G20 and at the level of the international community has to be basically handed over once you've had a G20 meeting into an institution that then does a day-to-day implementation and moves the agenda. At the moment, we have that in financial crisis. When there is a financial crisis, we know how to act. We don't have that with the climate crisis. We have conference of people, we moved the agenda along, but we are already in the crisis. And we need a crisis management tool, as opposed to the way we set it up still looks a bit like we're designing a prevention tool. We actually need to manage the day-to-day of this climate crisis. And I can tell you, the best example for me on why we made this call for the IMF and the World Bank to play the role was the pandemic crisis. We did have a World Health Organization that, dare I say it, more or less miserably failed to coordinate at the global level the pandemic, because what we acted on in the pandemic was we tried to solve a global viral problem by closing borders, by ring-fencing vaccination, and by looking for local solutions. Even the most traveled border that I travel, I work in Switzerland, I live in Germany, and I have a holiday home in the Netherlands. And the Swiss, German, and Swiss-Dutch border were always the most open border. Even they were hard to travel at that point in time. Unheard of, unthinkable, completely wrong, dealing with global problems through local solutions. And that's where I feel the equivalent for the pandemic and the financial crisis is there. The pandemic was a risk known in principle, and we didn't prepare. You look back 10 years, the Bill Gates Foundation, there were so many reports that we could see something like that. I don't need to tell you how many reports there are that tell you we are in the middle of an emerging and continuing and strengthening global climate crisis that has many, many unreversible elements. So again, and we do have, in my view, we do have the tools available to deal with that. We just need to apply them. We need a crisis management framework. We need roles and responsibilities. We need handovers when we had top-level meetings to an institution that does the day-to-day. And I think that is simple, plain vanilla, how you deal with crisis management and crisis resolution. We have the prevention part that we're working on, but we don't have the management and the resolution part. And that's where I think all of these things I tried to talk about come in. Actually, if I can just make one reaction to something that was said, I think the ECB and IOPA and others quite rightly look at this as a stress testing exercise for stress that is potentially coming. It's like a CCAR process, Eventually you will have stresses and they will impact you. And in a way, when you issue, that's how I thought about it at UBS, when you issue your net zero plan, you're almost applying for a capital relief up front, because you have a more consistent plan with less capital stress down the road if you have a good transition plan. But, what is very important is this is very hard. This is risk that isn't just manageable. These are very often 0-1 risks. And that's where I think you need much bigger contingency plans when you want to deal with that. And so I do think that transition plans and net zero commitments are a very, very important part of a corporate strategy. But then you need to, when you make these pronouncements and you announce them to your shareholders and your investors, they're much more binding than an internal plan of what you actually want to do. They become part of your global commitment strategy. And once you have a commitment strategy, somebody needs to look at whether that commitment is reasonable to start with, and whether you over time implement that commitment, or whether it was just a commitment strategy that basically didn't have a lot of follow-up. And that's where I think, these trajectories that the corporates commit to should be part also of the capital stress scenarios over much longer time periods than your usual 3-year conjunctural stress. We're talking here about 20, 30-year stress scenarios with massive impact down the road. And so, you can't deal with that through capital, but you can deal with it by exiting very adverse strategies that might haunt you later down the road. So it's more a business plan as a capital stress plan.
Well, if I look at you and I would be kind of in a more intimate setting at a dinner, and I ask you, what's your one wish to policymakers? And you are completely free, although I understand policymaking nowadays on the 10th of June in Europe is an interesting conversation to have, but still under known circumstances, what would that be?
Bring the future to today. And it's almost like we pre-arranged this, but I just want to build on the transition plan point. I think a lot of focus has been on what is green so far. If you look at least at the European regulatory space, we need to know much more. We need to finance much more the transition. And to have these transition plans in place, there's a push on banks now with the Capital Requirements Directive 6 that will enter into force soon. Banks need to make transition plans from a risk perspective, and we will supervise. But of course, they need to know what's in transition plans from companies to rely it on. And therefore, this is the ISSB house today. And I really want to call the ISSB to stand up and see what kind of convergence can they bring to transition plans globally on the requirements there. Can you set a global baseline on that? We compared all the different requirements that are currently being developed all around the globe, Singapore, UK, other places in the world. If you slam it down, it basically comes down, you need to have your governance, your strategy, your risk management, and your metrics and targets. To have such a global baseline and build on top of that going forward. And the last thing I want to say, maybe to your point, Mr. Weber, do we need a new body that just crisis management? If you think about the urgency, yes. I also want to place emphasis for the ECB to start working on climate. We didn't have to change the mandate. So it also comes down, and before we maybe have the ultimate crisis management in place globally, personal leadership. And standing up, saying, yes, this is for us. This is something we're going to fix. And with transition plans, you think about the future. Okay, 2050, that's where we want to be as a company. That means that tomorrow, this action we are going to put in place. And this is what we need from others to be able to deliver on it.
So not only plans, but also good governance, strong governance. Patrick, your wish or wishes?
Yeah, I don't think I will say new things because I heard a couple of the speakers before also mentioning those points, which I just wanted to reiterate. Because I mentioned that it starts with the data being aware of the risks. Data is about credibility of information. So I think that point was well raised, and also keeping it simple. I think this is also close to my heart there, having been involved in data in the past. If we really want to make a difference and understand it, we need not to overcomplicate matters. We need to try to keep things as simple and as close to the business as possible, because that's the only way I believe we can get to reliable information, information that on that basis we're able to steer. And it's also an element where I would say it needs to be in the area where there is a joint also interest. It's not only about joint responsibility, but there's also a business interest as a business to understand the risk that you're engaging in. So if there is, you could say, a set of key information that is close to your own business, that is understandable, that you know is going to be reliable from you as a source to the ones that are compiling it, I think then we're all supporting each other in the system. But it can only work if we find the right balance there. So keeping it simple is key also to be able, at the end of the day, to tackle such a big problem.
So in a way, meaningful, proportionate, and useful for business steering at the end. Axel, your last words on that topic.
Well, when I was a young man, I liked sports, and I always loved this one company's logo that was just do it. And I do think when it comes to climate, my recommendation is just do it. The perfect is the enemy of the good. when it comes here. And it's absolutely right what you said about the mandate. If you look at the World Bank, poverty reduction and sustainable growth, you don't need to change anything on the mandate, just do it. You look at the IMF, preventing future financial crisis, you don't need to change the mandate, just do it. What you need is, when you just want to do it, you need a lot more resources, because this is probably, of all of the programs I've seen, the most expensive, the most globally redistributive from top countries to bottom, and the most south-north, I would say, enabling. And what we've geared when we use capital and in financial is we live in a world where capital flows from the south to the north, from the emerging to the US. We need to reverse global capital flows for climate and have money flow from the US and the mature world to emerging markets and developing countries in order to prevent the climate crisis there. Because if these countries do have their development that they need to have and grow, they can only do it with an energy backbone that is much more carbon-based than that of industrial countries already is now. And that's a recipe for disaster on climate. So we need to see that we're all in this together, and money needs to go where it's most needed. And that's where I think global climate programs need to really have emerging market investments by mature country as the prime recognition that that's what you need to do. And your ESG targets, doesn't matter whether Germany fulfills them by investing in Germany, probably better bang for the buck if they invest in frontier markets and developing countries. So we need that new understanding of a global collaboration. And where I'm concerned is we're seeing just the opposite. Just look at the election. We see more inward-looking solutions that are not focused on the big picture and the global picture. And we really need to re-educate everyone that this is what is needed. It's a global problem. It's a global solution. Money is needed where it's least available. Thank you.
Well, a global problem, a global solution, and a global baseline. And let me thank you for this wonderful conversation, and join me in thanking this panel. Thank you very much.